Well, my mom works for Riot, and she's gonna ban you.
Well, that didn't age well. Well, Smolder is finally out with just about everything we would expect from a new champion. From the gameplay, to the voice lines, to the theme, to finally, his lore. Which is a very grand thing these days, because truth be told, we don't get a lot of story anymore. So, how is Smolder's story holding? It's okay. But that's because the story of Smolder specifically is nothing special. What's happening around him is far cooler. Yes, we'll get to that, you just wait. Now, given the fact that Smolder is from Gamavor, it shouldn't be a surprise that his entire story gets a lot better after you read the entire Ruination novel, which is a novel that not only tells the story of Viego, but it also tells us about the history of Gamavor, which was Viego's kingdom. But I understand that not everyone will immediately rush out to get the book, so as we go through the story, I will point out some of the cool things which we have learned about in the Ruination novel. So without further ado, let's dive into some lore again. Long before Gamavor was even called Gamavor, this entire place was occupied by dragons, who enjoyed their time here until humans arrived. And as it tends to be, with mortals also comes conflict. Not only just between the humans, but the conflict also included the dragons. And the battles continued until the first king of Gamavor bowed before the dragon matriarch. He bowed his knee and asked the dragons to lend their strength to their armies, so that together they could forge an empire. And so, the dragon, who eventually became known as the Grandmother Viper, and the Gamavoran ruler swore an oath of Vol Visperi Desenvain, which bound their lineages for entire generations. And this is where some of the cool info from the Ruination novel comes into play. See, in the novel we learned how Gamavor was founded. It was founded by the twins Gamor and Avora, hence Gamavor. With Gamor being a pretty ruthless warlord who decided to conquer the entire continent. Not only that, he was also the original wielder of Sanctity, which as we know is the blade of the ruined king. Now after Gamor struck a deal with Grandmother Viper, the dragons remained fiercely loyal to the throne and the high houses who passed the trials of their oath. And in return, the dragons would be well fed with livestock, and they would be showered in offerings such as gold and jewelry. This is where some of you may remember that this is exactly what we have seen in Smolder's reveal teaser. We did see someone from the Gamavoran lineage holding Sanctity, but this is some generations down because this really doesn't seem to be Gamor. But also some of the other scenes actually shows us the deal of the Gamavorans with the dragons. Anyway, over time, with all the gold and the jewelry and the artifacts, the dragons became highly respected by the humans. And partially it was because they didn't wanna anger them. Because if they did, they risked that the dragons would just melt all of their precious items. But as centuries passed, the Grandmother Viper became a legend. She didn't die. That would come later. And her brood started thinning down. After which suddenly the young king Viego Santiarul Molach Volkalach Haigari called upon the Imperial Dragons to accompany him and his totally not so brutal army to the Blessed Isles. Of course, the very simplified version of the story here is: Viego did this because he was desperate to find a cure for his dying wife Isolde. And Callista found out about the Waters of Life on the Blessed Isles, which could give her a chance. So Viego, being Viego, decided to brute force his way there. But when Viego called out to the Imperial Dragons for help, the dragons refused. Because they recognized what Viego was trying to do was madness. However, even after they decided to stay back at home on Gamavor, they couldn't escape the events of the Ruination, where Isolde died even before they got onto the Blessed Isles. With Hecarim's help, Viego slaughtered his way all the way to the Waters of Life, where Thresh helped him dip his dead wife into the waters, who then turned into a wraith and stabbed Viego with his own soul-bounding blade, which made the entire island explode in undeath magic. But that's just the super TLDR version. So after Viego essentially abandoned his kingdom to cause an apocalypse elsewhere, back home, the handful of dragons who survived witnessed the neglect and conflict which eventually turned Kamavor into ruins. Following these events, one time skip later, centuries would pass before another Imperial dragon would be born. And I think we all know where this is going. As this hatchling grew, his mother would have to hunt further and further from their home to find bigger prey. But of course, every time she would leave to get some food, it would leave the nest vulnerable. And eventually, some Noxian beastmasters took advantage of that. And on one such occasion, they snuck in, they stole the hatchling, and they ran away so they could sell it back home in Noxus. Of course, it didn't take long for the mother to find out that the hatchling is gone. And soon after that, she learned what ship the hatchling was on. So of course, she swooped in, she burned the entire ship, because remember, these dragons can't be harmed with their fire. If anything, it is healing them. But unfortunately, in all of this chaos, the hatchling was swept away. And it ended up on an island just off of the Noxian mainland. There, scared, alone, and hungry, the hatchling enjoyed the fact that it can finally use its mother's lessons. And so, it finally got to hunt. And on one of its adventures around this new strange land, it stumbled upon a young boy called Marinos. And it didn't take long before the two became friends, and the boy called this hatchling Smolder. As the two learned how to communicate with each other, which means that the boy taught Smolder how to talk, their friendship grew, but they still kept Smolder as a secret. Marinos was afraid that if someone found out, they would try and sell Smolder to the mainland. But over time, as time passed and the boy grew into a man with responsibilities and a family, he had less and less time to play with Smolder. And so, in order to amuse himself, Smolder decided to learn how to breathe fire just like the dragons from Marinos' stories. After many attempts, instead of just sneezing sparks, one time he actually breathed fire. And throughout the excitement, he didn't notice that he also happened to ignite an entire forest, which went up in smoke, after which it didn't take long for his mother to find him. And so the sounds of hunting horns rippled around, with a giant roar ringing through the sky. It was his mother who has arrived and embraced its child. She then picked up her hatchling and carried him away from the growing inferno, which incidentally was Smolder's first experience with flight. Which takes us into the present days, where Smolder spends a lot of time with his mother in their cliffside nest. We don't know where they are exactly, but they still should be somewhere around Noxus. And that's because, currently, his mother is teaching Smolder how to embrace his draconic abilities, such as flight or breathing fire, but she also tells him about their draconic lineage and the importance of Imperial dragons. Because one day, when he is ready, together they would return to their ancestral home, and they would usher a new golden age for Kamavor. And that is Smolder's story. Now, as I said, in my opinion, all the lore around Kamavor and dragons is far better than the lore of Smolder alone. Which, to be fair, I do believe this was intended. I do believe that Smolder was written as not the most interesting character yet, because it's the setup around him that gets really cool. I mean, they are setting up the fact that one day in the future, dragons will return to Kamavor, and it is gonna be a big moment, and I mean, these setups have to have some point, right? They are never gonna pay this off directly in League. Ah, man. But yes, at this point, pretty much every setup that is aimed at the future has to end up there. And yes, I'm not the only one who believes that Smolder's mother, for example, is a lot more interesting than just Smolder. If you just go around the internet and you look at some of the comments, you will have to bleach your own eyes. But yes, to be fair, the concept art of Smolder's mother is stunning. Like, this is the dragon everyone wants to see in League. Now, of course, we know that you can't really fit a giant dragon into a tiny model on the Summoner's Rift, but this is a stellar design. And in case you are wondering where this one came from, it is actually in his theme. Speaking of which, the music is cool, but it didn't have too many Kamavoran references. At least none that I really noticed. Again, it is cool to see that the Ruination novel actually enhances this story in a really cool way. But also, there are some other champions, such as Neela, who play an interesting role here. Because after Neela picked up the powers of Ashlash and she decided to just go around the world and hunt big creatures, one of those creatures just happened to be the Grandmother Viper, the original dragon who struck a deal with the first king of Kamavor. Yep, as the story said, this dragon just hid somewhere and they became a legend and they didn't really bother anyone. And then Neela came in and ruined everything again. But yes, connecting those stories together also felt really cool. We could also point out that Smolder does have some cool voice lines. They are not really that important besides some memes, though he does have some funny ones against Jarvan, recognizing that Jarvan smells like a dragon for some reason. And when he talks to Viego, his mother is just obviously shouting behind him. But there you have it. The story of Smolder, a new piece of lore after a long time, unless you count the cinematic. Which also unfortunately means that now there is gonna be another lore break, because it's probably gonna take a while before we get the next champion. And in the meantime, there is gonna be Bandletale. But outside of that, I don't know what else to expect. If there is one thing I am really not expecting, it is a short story. I don't wanna get bamboozled again though.